Shabbat Shalom, everybody. It's nice to see you. I too have missed this space. It's been a couple of weeks since I've been here. This week is double portion, Behar-Bechukotai, two parshas for the price of one. As some of you might know this from my chatting and other sessions, but I'm a lifelong Cubs fan, and when there's a double parsha, I think about Ernie Banks, the great Chicago Cubs Hall of Famer who used to love Sundays. He would say, "Let's play two," because there are always doubleheaders on Sunday. So I always think of him when there's two parshas. We can, for one Shabbat, it's like a doubleheader. There's extra baseball or extra Torah. But alas, we don't have double the time this morning. We should think about that. When there's a double parsha, we should do an hour and a half so we could cover it all. We're going to spend a little time thinking about the very first verse of Parashat Bahar, which is the first of the two parshiot this week. So I am going to, let me just do this. I'm putting a link to my slides in the chat, which you could click over to, and I'm going to share my screen. So I could bring up the first slide, and that'll bring us into it here. Oh, here we go. Starting the slideshow. All right. Thanks for your patience there. I gotta just move the Zoom pop-up windows so it's not in the way of my text, and then we'll be ready to go. Okay, here we go. Here is how this
Rabbi, sorry to cut you off. That's what I was going to ask. Slideshow. Great. Amazing. It's now larger than it was. Go for it.
Oh, okay, great. Yep. Yes, my computer just had to catch up to okay, good. Perfect. So here's how we start. God spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, and God says the following: speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land that I assign you, that's the land of Israel, the land shall observe a Sabbath of God. 6 years may you sow your field, and 6 years may you prune your vineyard and gather in the yield. But in the 7th year, the land shall have a Shabbat of complete rest, a Shabbat of God. You shall not sow your field or prune your vineyard. So this is where the Torah establishes the sabbatical cycle. Just like we have in our weekly cycle 6 days of work and 1 day of rest, the land of Israel gets 6 years of work and 1 year, 6 years of work and 1 year of rest. The agriculturalists, of which I'm not, say it's good for the land. For the same way rotating the crops is good, like letting the land not be harvested for a year and not be plowed for a year is good to help it recover. This is built into the biblical system, a 7-year cycle. As we read about this, I should mention we're in a 7-week cycle right now, as the days, we count the days between the second day of Passover and the holiday of Shavuot, where we also count 7 weeks, 7 times, 49 days, and then Shavuot's on the 50th. So there are lots of magic sevens and 7 times 7s in the Torah, and this is one of them. And actually, this week's parsha starts with an introduction of the sabbatical year and its rules. It moves on to talk about the Jubilee cycle, which is after 7 cycles of the sabbatical year, there's a 50th year of Jubilee, where more things happen besides letting the land lie fallow, et cetera, et cetera. It's not strange for the Torah to give us laws about a new topic. It's not strange for a particular Torah portion to begin with a new set of rules about a new category of law. But what is interesting here towards the end of Leviticus is this opening verse from which this week's parsha, the first of the two, gets its name. Right? It starts, God spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai, right? Ve'adaber Adonai Moshe Behar Sinai, on Mount Sinai, right? Behar becomes the name of the parsha, and we refer to it. Oftentimes, we're used to saying, right, God says to Moses, say to the Israelite, speak to the Israelite people and say to them. That's usual. The unique piece in this verse is that it locates Moses on Mount Sinai. Now, if we go back to the middle of Exodus, where there was, right, the revelation and the giving of the 10 utterances, the 10 commandments, right, on Mount Sinai. There's a whole chapter about the people come to Mount Sinai, they prepare, they're at Mount Sinai, laws are given. There's a whole episode that takes a couple chapters. And through the rest of the Torah, there's lots of presentation of lots of laws, but this is the one instance outside of the Mount Sinai episode or the retelling of that episode in Deuteronomy, where a new set of laws is introduced with this phrase, Bahar Sinai. And it raises a question, well, why here? Why is it that in this place is there this reference to Mount Sinai? And what do we learn from that? And so that's what we're going to dig into a little bit today. Why did the text not, well, I'll say it this way, the text could have just said, God spoke to Moses, speak to the Israelite people, and here are the laws of the sabbatical year. Would have been the pattern it usually has, but there's this extra phrase, and it catches people's attention. Here's what Rashi has to say about this. He asked the question in a little different way from how I just phrased it. Rashi says the following, right? What has the matter of the sabbatical year to do with Mount Sinai that Scripture felt compelled to expressly state where it was commanded? Were not all the commandments given at Sinai? So Rashi's noticing this is a unique episode, right? This usually is not how things are told, and wants to know what's so special about the sabbatical year, or what's so special about the connection between the sabbatical year and Mount Sinai that here the Torah added this detail. Because it could have, says Rashi, added it to any of the other details of any of the other laws are given. So I want you to notice one thing that's embedded in the question, an assumption that Rashi makes, which is this last phrase, were not all the commandments given at Sinai? Rashi's making an assumption that it's not just, right, the 10 commandments that are given at Sinai, that the rest of the Torah is given there as well. The Torah's narrative supports a lot of that, right? The Israelites stay at Sinai for a while before they move on. Lots of other laws are given in and around, right, while they're camped at Mount Sinai. Not every single one of them, but Rashi already exposes a bias that we have in our tradition that the whole Torah was given at Mount Sinai, which leads to this question, if the whole Torah is given at Mount Sinai, we could either note this every time, or maybe not at all, but why, he's noticing the unique piece. But his assumption is all laws were given at Sinai, why just make the connection here? Here's Rashi's answer to that question. He says the following, this statement is intended to suggest the following comparison. Just as the laws of Shemitah, that's the sabbatical year, its general rules, its specific prescriptions and minute details were ordained at Mount Sinai, so too were all the commandments with their general rules and their minute details ordained at Mount Sinai. So Rashi's answer is actually there's not anything special about these rules, the laws of the sabbatical year that connect them to Mount Sinai more than any other set of laws. But this is the place where we actually jump to the assumption that all the laws were given at Mount Sinai. And the notion is, if it happened in this case, it happened in all cases. So really the way he phrased the question is, what's so special about, right, the sabbatical year that the Torah specifically connected those laws to Mount Sinai? And Rashi's answer is basically, well, nothing really. These laws are important, but they're just as important as all the laws. So what do we learn from the fact that here it says Mount Sinai? We can extrapolate from this verse that if with the laws, the introduction to the laws of the sabbatical year, the Torah is telling us that this presentation of the laws happened at Mount Sinai, we should extend that to all the set of all the rules and all the other laws that were given. They also were given at Mount Sinai. So sort of the assumption that's embedded in Rashi's question, were not all commandments given on Sinai, is exactly what Rashi says this verse comes to reinforce. We assume, we know, we have this tradition that all the laws were given at Mount Sinai, and it's this verse that gives us the hint to it, because, argues Rashi, if the Torah takes the moment here about the Shemitah to mention that it's Mount Sinai, it's not specific to this, it's generalizable, and we're going to apply it to everything else. And so Rashi sees here the hint in the Torah something that becomes embedded in our tradition, that all of Torah was given at Sinai. You might be familiar with that tradition. It might be something that's part of your belief system, right? That it's not just the 10 Commandments that are given at Mount Sinai, it's all of Torah that's given at Mount Sinai. If you're reading Parashat Shavua regularly, a close read of the Torah suggests that there are alternative options to this as well. You don't have to conclude that just because the sabbatical rules were given at Sinai because the Torah says that mean everything else is. In fact, some of the other laws that were given, seems from where they're given and where the stories are, they're placed in other spots. And it could be that only the 10 Commandments were given at Mount Sinai. And the chapters after that, what we've been looking at, the chapters after that about the building of the tabernacle, the chapters about the sacrifice that have been in Leviticus might all be in Mount Sinai. And it's not till after Vayikra is over and we move on to Bamidbar that the journeys continue. But there are some new laws that are given in the book of Bamidbar that we haven't seen yet. And you might say those happen at different places. But no, says Rashi, in this place anyways, this teaching from the first pasuk of our Parsha is his proof that this is where, that the location of the giving of all the laws, even if they're repeated elsewhere later, happen at Mount Sinai. And it's the spark of this tradition that has embedded itself quite nicely in Jewish tradition. So that's point number one that Rashi teaches us here about the laws from our Parsha. And it expands this notion that, or embeds this notion that all the mitzvot came at Sinai into our minds and into the tradition. Want us to look at a rabbinic text that takes this notion maybe one step further. It'll be interesting to look at a new lens about this tradition and what it says about this comment of Rashi and maybe how we think about this as a whole. We're going to turn to a rabbinic passage from the Babylonian Talmud in Masechet Menachot, which happens to do with a grain offering. With the narrative we're going to look at doesn't have to do with the content of the chapter. This is an oft referred to story, so it might be new to you, it might be familiar to you, but it's a snapshot of a different moment. You'll see what that is because it's introduced in the story. So here it goes. Rav Yehuda says that Rav says. So it's we have this passed down from one rabbi to another. When Moses ascended on high, so Moses at the end of his life goes up to heaven. He found the Holy One sitting and tying crowns on the letters of the Torah. Right, when Moses ascended on high, could be a reference at the end of his life. He goes up to heaven. Could be also ascended up to Mount Sinai. We don't know exactly the place of this, but what does he, right, for that story to make place? It makes sense in terms of the chronology. This might be when he ascended up to heaven from the top of Mount Sinai. What does he see God doing with the text of the Torah? God is tying crowns on the letters of the Torah. What does that mean? If you're familiar with what the font of the Torah is in a Torah scroll, it's a fancy font. It's not a plain old ordinary font. Some of the letters have extra little crowns, extra little designs that glorify them. If you look at a Torah, you'll see certain letters have extra details that fancy the letters. Some of them, when they're few together, they sort of look like a crown. So Moses sees God adding to the Torah this fancy font. Moses says to God, Master of the universe, who is preventing you from giving the Torah without these additions? I like how he asks that in this tale. Moses says, God, what are you doing? You're giving us the Torah. You could give it however you want. Why are you spending this extra time, putting these extra flourishes on the letters of the Torah? It's your Torah. Give it how what's motivating you to do this? So here's God's answer. God says, there's a man who's destined to be born after several generations, right? One day into the future, someone's going to be born. And Akiva ben Yosef is his name. His name is Akiva ben Yosef. You might know him better if you're familiar with the Talmud or rabbinic literature as Rabbi Akiva, right? One of the great teachers of the Talmudic period. And Rabbi Akiva says, God is destined to derive from each and every thorn of these crowns and mounds, each and every thorn of these crowns, mounds upon mounds of halachot. What's Akiva ben Yosef going to do one day? He's going to look at the Torah. He's going to see these extra details in the font of the Torah, and each little detail of each little letter is going to, for him, be the source of a new law. Not only is he going to derive laws from the letters of the Torah, from the words, from the sentences, from the paragraphs, but these extra details that are in the font, embedded in the fonts, Rabbi Akiva is going to use to help shape the law. He's going to derive laws from them, and so from them. And so what's what God's saying to Moses is, I need to add these to the Torah because one day Rabbi Akiva is going to need them to help interpret the Torah. Interesting, right? The story continues. So Moses says to God, Master of the universe, show him to me. Moses is like, I want to see what this is like. You mean there's a guy who's going to derive rules from the crowns of the Torah? I want to see what this is like. So God says, return behind you, turn around. So in Moses being on high up in heaven with God, God tells him to turn around. Moses turn around and he ends up, there's a magical moment. He ends up in Rabbi Akiva's classroom. Right? Moses went and sat at the end of the 8th row in Rabbi Akiva's study hall. Right, so he sits on one of the back benches with the newer students and he watches. So Moses is plopped into Rabbi Akiva's classroom and he watches. And what does the Talmud say? And Moses sits in this 8th row and did not understand what they were saying. Moses is in Rabbi Akiva's academy and he can't follow the conversation that the rabbis are having, the Talmudic conversation about the Mishnah, about Jewish law, and Moses' strength wanes. Either he gets tired from just sitting, following this conversation he can't follow, or somehow he's weakened by the fact that here he is, he's in this great scholar's classroom generations later, but he can't follow the conversation, not a position Moses used to being in. So he feels weakened by this experience. When Rabbi Akiva arrived at the discussion of one matter, one of his students said to him, so Rabbi Akiva is teaching something, we don't even know what. A student raises his hand and Rabbi Akiva calls on him. The student asks the following, my teacher, from where do you derive this? That's a regular Talmudic question. What's the source of this? Usually it's a student or someone asking, what's the biblical verse that we base this law on? So it's a normal question, and the student's saying, hey, Rabbi Akiva, you taught us this law. What's the biblical source for this? Here's not a surprise based on what God said before in the story. Rabbi Akiva said to them, it's a halacha, it's a law transmitted to Moses from Sinai. This rule that I just taught you isn't in the verses itself. It's in the laws that Moses passed on from Mount Sinai. And when Moses heard this, his mind was put to ease. So Moses, who was growing weary of it, maybe frustrated of this conversation and couldn't follow, is appeased by the fact that when the student asked for the source, Rabbi Akiva attributes it back to him. It's a lovely story. It's a lovely moment about sort of Moses seeing the future of his work. Right? Moses is the person who receives Torah directly from God and transfers it on for the Jewish people, and then it has some life of its own. Right? Moses gets curious and asks God, why are you decorating the font? We don't need a fancy font. Give the Torah however you want. Why are you doing all this extra work? God tells him there's a purpose, and the purpose is even these things are going to be part of the tradition. And one day in the future, when the tradition has moved on, Rabbi Akiva is even in the Sayyuka. So what I love about this sort of builds on Rashi's commentary that we saw before. No, excuse me a second. Sorry for my my grumbled voice a little bit today. Here's a rabbinic story from the Talmud that does two things. First, it acknowledges the fact that Jewish tradition develops over time. Right? There are things that the rabbis tell their students, right? I don't have a verse for this in the Torah. I have a tradition that goes back to Moses. So it says there's a Jewish tradition that's part of the laws of the Torah, and we can sometimes find verses for them. And there's a whole set of tradition also also given at Sinai that was passed down, not through the words of Torah, but from Moses through the traditions. And there are lots of things we can derive it from, sometimes from tradition, sometimes from the words, sometimes from the actual font itself, and it moves forward. And in some way, this story from the Talmud is expanding upon what Rashi said before, right? If we start, the Torah says, these laws of sabbatical the laws of sabbatical were given by Moses to the people at Mount Sinai. They're given by God to Moses, from Moses to the people at Mount Sinai. Rashi says that verse comes to teach us that, it taught it here, but you can imply it everywhere. The whole Torah, every piece of it, all happened at Sinai. That's where we got it. And this story expands to say, not just the whole Torah we got at Sinai, but even the traditions that we have that are not in the Torah were passed down from Moses at Sinai to us today. So in some way, this story is one step further from the Rashi comment we saw in the Parsha. At the same time, I think it also is a story that undermines this interpretation if we look at it from a different lens. But if the rabbis and the Talmud are trying to justify the teachings that they have that expand from the Torah, that expand from the verses, right? There are lots of things the rabbis talk about that don't have any verses in the Torah itself. I'll give you a good example because it's Friday midday where I am. Shabbat is coming, a universal practice for many of us, right, across the world. For Jesus, we start Shabbat with lighting candles. Lighting candles, right? We say a blessing for lighting the candles that say God commanded us to do this. Nowhere in the Torah does it tell us to light candles for Shabbat. And so when we say, right, we're going to light candles for Shabbat, we do that for Shabbat, but that we don't do that because the Torah says, right? Shabbat's in the Torah, but the notion that there's the lighting of candles is not from the Torah, and that's something we've added. But you could put it in to this tradition from Rashi on Bahar to the story from the Talmud that says, well, this goes far, 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 far back, and this has been handed down to us for a long time. But sometimes when you look at it with a critical lens, this also could be a way in which the rabbis are telling the story to say, to trying to empower their own innovations about Torah. Meaning the rabbis know they're innovative, they're creative. The rabbis know they're shaping Judaism. The rabbis know they're making changes, they're making adjustments, and they're open to critique potentially from the question that the student asked in Rabbi Akiva's classroom that Moses observed. Hey, what's your source for this? And the rabbis might have their own source of logic. They might have their own reason to evolve Judaism. So a lot of what the rabbis did to shape Judaism has to do with the fact that before their time, Judaism was temple-based. And when the temple was destroyed, the rabbis had to shift Judaism and make it appropriate for a non-temple era, which turned out to be the next 2,000 years plus. And in doing that, things changed. And to claim authority for the innovations and changes that they did, they wanted to make the innovations as part of tradition and ascribe them back. And a story like this one in the Talmud says, when Rabbi Akiva says, well, I know this, it's a tradition from Moses at Sinai, it helps give authority to what the rabbis are doing and operate in the system that says, yeah, we're innovating here, but we want you to think of it as everything happened at Sinai. So it makes me wonder, and there's an open question for this. When we think about the whole Torah was given at Mount Sinai, question I have for all of us to think about as we read the Torah in Parashat Shavua, does the Torah believe that? Rashi today suggested that it does and starts to say that we should believe that about that. And the Talmud, the story we read today says, not only was all the Torah given at Mount Sinai, so much more was as well. To all of you as readers of our sacred texts and regulars who come to this session, or if you're here for the first time, maybe some new folks too, it's a chance to ask this question: how much of this notion that all of it was given at Sinai is something that was embedded later into the tradition, and how much it's something that comes from the tradition from the beginning itself? There's not one total simple answer to this question. I've hinted at, I think, in my presentation today about where I might sit, and maybe in the question and answer time, you might drill down and I might say more. But I think it's a really good open-ended question for you to think about as you look at this Parsha and others. Where does this notion that all the Torah was given at Sinai originate? And do we have texts that suggest some of the Torah was given at Sinai, but other parts of it were given other places? And what do we make of that, the diversity of opinions we might find in our tradition? All right, with that, I'm going to pause. I'm going to stop share so I can see more of you on the screen. I see that since I started, 35 of you or so have commented. I wasn't able to follow that. But I'm going to turn things back to Mara, who's really good at facilitating getting the questions out.
Yeah.
So that we can have a little bit of a dialogue.
There were some notes on like the origin or the root of the word Sinai, and if that meant a place or if it was connected to what I believe the Hebrew word is for bush, which sounds similar. But I just saw Susie's hand, but it went away. I was about to call on you as well. But if you have anything to share, Rabbi, about the word Sinai, I'm
Well, I know for sure the word snah, which is the word for bush, like the burning bush, is different from the word Sinai, different roots. There's not a linguistic relationship for them.
So thank you, Rob. You were correct.
Yeah, I believe I'd have to go back and look this up. I can't, my brain doesn't work this way anymore. I think there are midrashim, there's rabbinic commentary about names of mountains in the Bible that connects that tries to understand the mountain based on the word in its name. It'd take me longer than we have left to find them and present that. But the rabbis sometimes look at the names of the mountains and the names of places and draw some conclusion about the linguistic piece. So whoever asked that question, it's a good rabbinic question. What are the letters that make up the name Sinai, and what can I learn about the mountain and the place because of that? And I wish I could fill in the blanks to give you more, but I need to study a little bit more to be able to do that. And there are lots of commentaries. You know, there is a place in the Sinai desert that some traditions hold is Mount Sinai. There's actually it's a nice hike up to the top, and there's a monastery up there. If you can get to the Sinai, it's a lovely place to visit. It's mostly Christian tradition that has picked that place as Mount Sinai. In Jewish tradition, Mount Sinai is a little more anonymous and modest of a mountain if you give it personality. And we actually don't know the place. And some of that reason is so that we don't go there and make it a shrine. But if you're in the Sinai visiting the place that is called Mount Sinai today, it's a cool hike and it's an interesting visit. Anyways, I think Susie, we were going to give the floor to you.
Yeah, we'll go to Susie and then Kathy.
Thank you. In answer to what you posit as a question, Rabbi, I like to think that it was all given at Sinai, and it was given to all of us, future generations as well. I take from the Abraham story where God tells Abraham that we will be enslaved for 400 years, but from there we will become a nation. So God is all seeing, knows the future. So he gives us things when we're ready. And we needed to have lost the temple and be in exile for Rabbi Akiva to have those crowns to be able to read, to add new laws that we needed in that time. And that's how I am most comforted to look at it.
Nice. Thanks, Susie. Like the theological statement that's rooted in says, right, God is all-knowing, so knows future, past, present, future, right? And there's a way in which Judaism unfolds and was meant to unfold based upon the needs at a given time. There's a wholeness to that system, and that's definitely one way to read these texts and to see, right? And that's actually one of the points of, I think, from the rabbinic Talmudic perspective of that story, right? It's okay that Moses didn't understand what was going on in Rabbi Akiva's classroom, because what Judaism was in Akiva's time wasn't supposed to be what it was in Moses' time. And if we would all be taken out of our own time and plopped into a Jewish space, 1,000, 2,000, whatever number of years later, it's going to look different. And there's one way to read that story that says this is how it's supposed to be. And why Moses is comforted at the end is, even though it's changed, it's still attributed back to him. There's still continuity, even with the change. So Susie, I like that read. Thank you for sharing that. Kathy, I think you're next.
You able to unmute? There you go.
Here we go. Hi, good morning. So yes, I do believe most of the laws were given at Mount Sinai, but as they traveled through the desert and situations came up, they had to figure out new laws and figure out what they were going to do, situations that cropped up. Just like we have the Constitution and we had amendments to the Constitution. So now we have to, as situations happen, which they did, we have to then amend what we received at Mount Sinai.
Nice. There's a ongoing development because, right, whether the Torah or the Constitution, right, you can have guidelines, you can have directions, but you can't anticipate everything possibly that's going to happen, and new questions come up. How do we apply this? How does that happen? Right. We see stories about that in the Torah. Right. Actually, we'll get to it this summer. There's a story of a family. The patriarch dies and there are only daughters, and the daughters come to petition and say, our rules of inheritance say everything goes to the sons, but there are no sons. We should get to inherit too. And the story of Benot Tzlofchad said that even God goes back and changes the rules for the human petition that happens there, with Moses intervening. So the Torah even acknowledges that that's part of the process. What you're saying, Kathy. Nice, thanks. Noreen, want to go next?
You should be able to unmute. There you go.
I just wanted, to me, the geographic location is not really the important thing here. It's, like any other part of our story that happens in the Torah, you can't prove it didn't happen, you can't prove it happened, but we believe it happened. And I think we believe in these laws, and saying that it comes from, designating that it comes from Sinai raises the level of the laws to a religious obligation, and gives it an authority and a gravitas, and that's what's important to me.
Got it. There's a sense that if Sinai is a metaphor, right, laws that come from Sinai have authority, are important.
Yeah.
And one way to read what Rashi said is to say, we should treat each of the laws as if they were given at that first moment with the Ten Commandments. I happen to like that approach, right? A pet peeve of mine is, I just said it, I don't like to talk about the 10 Commandments as the 10 Commandments. I think, right, the Hebrew says, Aseret HaDibrot, 10 utterances, right, 10 statements. But, Jewish tradition said the Torah is full of commandments, and they're all important. And I think sometimes when we say the 10 Commandments, right, somehow those are prefaced over others of them. Now, certainly some of the commandments of the 10 Commandments are ones that seem primary, right? Do not murder. If you had to pick one never to violate, that's a good one. There are some smaller detailed ones that if you skip over, doesn't have the same societal implications. But they're all important. And so maybe what Rashi's saying is, right, don't take this literally, like each of the, right, lots of commandments were taught in different places at different points in the story in the Torah, but we have to treat them all as if they're all Sinaitic, if they're all from that peak moment. And that gives them the gravitas, the equality, the way in which we could see them. These are all important. We have to take the whole thing seriously. And I like that because it says, it's not just the 10 Commandments, right? If you're a 10 Commandments person and those are the 10 things that you do, certainly I think that'll add spiritually and ethically to your life. But you want to take the whole package. And Rashi's saying, there's the laws of sabbatical and other laws as well. We should treat them at all as if they came from Sinai. And that's an expansive way. Nice, Noreen, I like that. Thank you for sharing that. Anybody else?
I'm not afraid of silence, but I think
I'm not either. I'm not either. I see the chat is still zooming, which is good. All right. I've been leaving too little time for questions recently. So I
Go into
intentionally
balance.
planned a little shorter to try to be my own, to not run out of time. And maybe
I appreciate it because I think we hear from people we don't always hear from, so it's great. And I thank you, Deborah, for stepping up.
Thank you. Thank you, Rabbi. Maybe you said this and I missed it. Is there anyone who pushes back or disagrees with Rashi on this teaching, or is it sort of everyone agrees that all the commandments were given at Sinai? And is there any relation to the idea like that all the Torah is supposed to be written by the hand of Moshe versus like people who, like the documentary hypothesis folks, who think of it more as a document that evolved over time?
Right. So first I'll say, embedded in your question, the way you phrased it, is there anyone who pushes back? The answer to that is there's definitely someone who pushes back somewhere, but
Of
I
course.
didn't do a full survey of all the medieval commentators, but listen, the question you raised is a good one. And the example you brought up is really a good one for that. Let me spend a minute on that, and then we can apply it to this week's Parsha. Right, there is a strong tradition that says God dictated the Torah to Moses, who wrote it down, and the document was written by, right? That God's words were recorded by Moses. The Torah says that in a number of places, right? The rabbis take hold of that idea. It's the image we have that God spoke to Moses, and part of what Moses did was, besides repeat it, Moses made the document. That's a very traditional Jewish image. The rabbis in the Talmud have a huge debate about the last 7 verses of the Torah on this very question. Because what happens in the last 7 verses? The last 7 verses, it says, Moses died on the mountain and God buried him. And the rabbis, the way this is framed is not a theological issue, but an ethical issue. Their question is, would God have made Moses write out these verses at the moment of Moses's death or before his death, right? Even if it's a week or 2 or a month before? Or is God the God of compassion and would not make Moses write out the 7 verses about Moses's death, and Joshua was the scribe for the last 7 verses? So it's like one of these first questions about, it's not about the place, but about who the scribe was. So some rabbis in the rabbinic tradition say Moses was the scribe for the whole thing, and part of the end of God and Moses' relationship before Moses' death was Moses coming to meet face on for this moment of him writing down the verses about his own death. And other people say, no, that I envisioned it differently. It's going to be Joshua wrote these verses, but yet there's a reason for that, and that's why they're in the Torah and not in the book of Joshua. So, right, Joshua is the scribe, according to tradition, who wrote the book of Joshua, but these 7 have Torah status, even though they're not from Moses, but out of compassion for Moses in his last days. So that's one way to look at that. There are, I would say this without giving us a survey of all the different commentators. There's a question that the rabbis, different commentators have a different approach to how literally we're supposed to read the Torah. So Rashi here isn't exactly, his comment that he brought isn't a literal one. It says these laws were brought at Sinai. And Rashi tells us that means all the laws were brought at Sinai. You could read the Torah through Rashi's lens to say any law that was given at Sinai, and based on Rashi, and if other laws are also given at another place, it's just a reiteration of it. So the laws were given at Sinai, some were reiterated in other places. But there's a more literal read that would say, no, many of the laws were given at Sinai, but at some point the Israelites moved on from Sinai, and the Torah says they're at this place and this happened and God gave these new laws. So that some of the laws were not given at Sinai. Where you stand on that depends on how literal you want to read the Torah. And to call back, I think it was like what Deborah said, could you metaphorically give Sinai status to laws that were given at some other place in the Sinai desert, or on the border of the land of Israel? You could give them Sinai authority even if they're given later. Although you could also argue, no, for them to be as important, they all must have been given at Sinai. So that conversation is certainly alive and well in rabbinic literature. And Deborah, we could spend some time studying your question by calling up the sources to say, how do the different commentators look at the places where the laws were given, and how many of them say only Sinai, and so how many of them say Sinai and other places? And it's a great it's a question about on three levels, which I think is what I meant to introduce today. What does the Torah say about this in its own words? What do the rabbis say about this when they're interpreting the Torah? And what do the rabbis say about this when they're just talking about the ongoing development of Judaism? And you'll find we have a multivocal tradition about this. Rashi's view is one of them. There are others that you'll see from place to place. You should keep looking for them as you go. All right, I think we have time for Jerry.
Are you able to unmute, Jerry?
Hi, Boker Tov.
Boker Tov.
First, Rabbi, I really wanted to, I welcome the opportunity. Thank you for your contributions on the Daf Yomi.
Oh, thank you.
I always look forward to them. They're always scintillating. The point that I just want to make is you made reference to the daughters of Tzlafchad, Benot Tzlafchad. And that's always troubled me in that it suggests that the daughters of Tzlafchad are saying, wait a second, Moshe, God made a mistake here by not permitting us to inherit land from our fathers. And the response that comes from God is, you know what, these ladies are right. I made a mistake. That's the sense we get. We just had a very similar, I won't say similar, identical instance a couple weeks ago when we learned about Pesach Sheni, the observance of Passover a month after the prescribed date, 14th day of Nisan, by those who were tameh, were ritually impure, and on Passover, on the date that's prescribed. And it's for me, it's always been the same thing. It's these people who were tameh, who were ritually impure, come to Moshe and say, wait a second, God made a mistake. Why should we be excluded from the participating in the sacrifice, the Paschal lamb sacrifice of Passover? And God essentially says, you know what, they have a point. So let's create a second day for those who could not do it the first day.
Yeah.
And that ties right into the Rashi that we began with. Was that something? Was the issue of the inheritance by women, Slavchad, was that given as Sinai to Moshe? And
Nice.
was
I like where you're going, Jerry. Thank you for that. Right. If we see some examples, and you mentioned two, of where in response to people's request, God makes an adjustment. So then the question is, could all of these be given at Sinai, right? If everything was given at Sinai, the adjustment would have already made at Sinai. We wouldn't have the original, right? Earlier, if you follow the logic there, right? So suggesting that all the laws were given at Sinai, literally, the examples in the Torah where the Torah itself shows the laws changed, challenges the notion that every law is given at Sinai. Because how could you give the original law and then there's an emendation that happens later? It is like a challenge to think about what that means. And depending, and how we untangle that revelational mess of if God in the Torah changes God's mind and changes the rules based on the petition of people, shouldn't God have anticipated that and fixed that in the rules in the first place? And what does that say about the assumption that God knows the future? Some might say, well, God made the rules the way they were to give people the opportunity to change it, and God was open to changing it for a game. And some people say, well, this is proof that the God of the Bible doesn't know the future. Right? One of the things I love about the Bible is God has the capacity to be surprised. It makes me think the God of the Bible is not, right? The Bible doesn't show us a God who knows the future. And why do I say that? Because there are plenty of times where God doesn't know what the outcome is going to be. God says, do this, hopes it's going to happen, and then waits and see. Or God is frustrated at the fact that it doesn't go the way that God wants. God is often frustrated, right, that the Israelites don't do what they're supposed to do, and the way in which God expresses that frustration suggests that God didn't know that all the time. So it's an interesting question. Does God, God's self, know, is God all knowing about the future, and is God as presented in the Bible all knowing about the future? I can tell you for sure, we're not going to solve that one today, and especially since now we're 2 minutes over. But thank you for bringing that up, Jer. Mara, I'm going to turn things back to you because I think we're out of time.
Thank you. Jackie, I'm going to put my email in the chat. Anyone is welcome to email me if you have other questions that we didn't get time to answer, and I will do my best to answer them or forward them to Rabbi Elliot.
Happy to.
In our non-existent leftover time, Rabbi, will you leave us with an intention or a blessing as we head into Shabbat this week?
Sure. A traditional Shabbat greeting when you pass someone, anytime you start on Wednesday, is to say Shabbat Shalom, right? We wish people a Shabbat of peace, of wholeness. We're living in a time where peace and wholeness sometimes feel a little more distant than normal. And I hope for each of us individually, this Shabbat brings us renewed peace and renewed wholeness and the strength to re-enter the world after Shabbat ends, and to help do what each of us can to expand the peace and wholeness of Shabbat into next week and the future, wherever you are and throughout the world as a whole.
Amen. Thank you so much,
Amen.
Rabbi. Thank you all for being here, and we hope to see you next week. Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody.